Tonight, record high heat. July set to be the world's warmest month on record. Plus, chaotic and deadly.
The withdrawal was a complete and total loss.
Republican lawmakers break down the failures leading up to the botched U.S. exit from Afghanistan. And the terrorist resurgence.
Afghan Christians are literally moving from house to house. They've switched off their phones.
Christians in mortal peril in the Taliban's terror haven. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The world sweating what could be the hottest summer on record. From our studio in Washington, D.C., I'm John Jessup. Welcome to Faith Nation. Well, no matter where you are, if you live somewhere in the United States, it's likely hot and possibly even record-breaking. While Americans coast to coast deal with extreme heat, President Biden is unveiling a White House plan to protect communities at risk from dangerously high temperatures. CBN White House correspondent Abigail Robertson joins us now for more. Abigail.
Well, John, President Biden is warning Americans that the #1 weather-related killer is heat, and he announced plans today to take action to combat rising temperatures.
I don't think anybody can deny the impact of climate change anymore.
Biden's new measures include an updated heat hazard alert to protect workers from extreme heat, putting $7 million into improving the nation's weather forecasts, and awarding $1 billion in grants to various cities to plant more trees in hopes of repelling heat.
We are making progress, but as we heard today, we have a lot more work to do.
The mayor of Phoenix joined President Biden remotely as our city is in the midst of record-breaking heat streaks.
It's taking a real toll on our community. We feel like we are very much on the front lines of climate change.
This month, Phoenix shattered its previous record of consecutive days with 110 degrees or greater, now at 27 days and counting. And there's not much break in the evening, with consecutive days of low temperatures of 90 degrees or more.
We need to work together to make sure all of us are on deck to address it. We need a whole of government approach.
Gallego wants Congress to give the president authority to declare heat a disaster, as Phoenix is on track to become the first major U.S. city to reach an average monthly temperature higher than 100 degrees, with no rain in 126 days.
We have some of the funds. We're working. We're going to get more, and I think we can make a difference.
The National Weather Service reports that California's Death Valley on Sunday reached a scorching 128 degrees. And in Miami, a record 100-plus heat index for 46 days straight. Even the ocean water surrounding the southern tip of the Sunshine State is hitting triple digits, causing coral bleaching, which experts predict could lead to death of multiple reefs in the Florida Keys that serve as a barrier for the coastline during intense storms. And it's not just Americans baking in the heat. The European Union Climate Monitor predicts July could be the warmest month on Earth's record, with Earth just experiencing the hottest June since records began in 1850. John?
All right, Abigail Robertson at the White House. Stay cool out there. Well, Joe Metamano is president and CEO of Central Union Mission, which works with the homeless population here in Washington. Joe, welcome to you. So we understand the dangers of extreme heat generally. Can you tell us how much more dangerous or how much more does it put the unhoused at risk?
Well, with a heat index in downtown Washington, D.C. of 105 right now, it's potentially deadly. For a person who lives on the street that's exposed to that all day long, they are likely dehydrated, potentially under the influence of drugs or alcohol. It is very likely a killer for somebody in those circumstances. And so we work very hard to try to mitigate that.
So where can people go to escape the extreme heat if they are unsheltered or experiencing homelessness?
So at our facility, for example, all day long, we distribute bottles of cold water, We have an air-conditioned day room for people to come in and just sit to escape the heat. We have an air-conditioned cafeteria where people can get 3 nutritious meals a day. And then in the evening, we have air-conditioned dorms. As a matter of fact, today we had to ramp up all of these efforts because we've seen more and more people coming to us for assistance to escape the heat. So we've had to put down additional bed mats in our chapel area and in our day room to accommodate more people overnight. But basically the goal is to keep people out of the heat, hydrated, and give them a respite from the intense heat and humidity.
Joe, I know you're very familiar with the numbers here in Washington. The homelessness has escalated since COVID, somewhere between the neighborhood of 5,000 and 10,000 people considered homeless in the nation's capital. How much more pressure has that put on groups like yours working to provide and meet the needs of homeless people?
A lot. The District of Columbia recently reported that there was about a 12% increase in the DMV area. So for us, that translates into providing more services, more beds, and we have especially seen an increase in the number of people coming to our food pantry for food assistance. That has shot up dramatically. Also, the number of meals that we serve at our shelter has shot up dramatically. Praise God, we have the resources to cover that right now. And the other piece that we're doing is we're still in COVID recovery mode. So all of those people who lost jobs in the COVID emergency can come to us now to get job training, job placement, English as a second language class, even help with addictions. So we're working hard at meeting the immediate needs of people living in poverty and homelessness, but also trying to get people off of the street permanently.
Joe, real quick here in 15 seconds or less if you can, what can people practically do to help if they want to help contribute?
The best thing to do is to support organizations like Central Union Mission or another. We're in place to do this, so supporting us or supporting other groups financially, or if the Lord leads you to do it, handing out cold bottles of water on the street is always helpful.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Joe Metamano with the Central Union Mission in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you also for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Well, chaotic and deadly. That's how Republicans describe the 2021 U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan as lawmakers on the House Foreign Affairs Committee today examine the Biden administration's preparation for withdrawal. CBN National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke covered today's hearing. Caitlin, members talked with witnesses involved in the military evacuation, but what were they hoping overall to accomplish?
John, the Afghanistan withdrawal has been under the microscope from the beginning. In a report released last year, Republicans on this committee determined it was a failure to plan that led to the scenes we all saw play out 2 years ago. Today's hearing is part of an ongoing effort to hold the Biden administration accountable and hopefully ensure something like this never happens again.
True leaders own mistakes, and this was a mistake of epic proportions.
Among those testifying Thursday, retired Colonel Seth Crumrick, who was directly involved with the planning of the 2021 withdrawal. He told lawmakers President Biden ignored military advice.
The bottom line is the administration controlled how we withdrew and when we withdrew, making them the majority stakeholder of many guilty parties in the failure and collapse of Afghanistan in the current Taliban rule.
Along with ignoring top military generals, Crumrick pointed to 3 other major decision failures by the administration, including the failure of both sides to follow the Doha Agreement, a peace deal between the U.S. and Taliban, selective intelligence blindness, and bad timing.
The withdrawal window, May to September of 21, was planned during the peak of the well-known Afghan fighting season. Why did the tactically meaningless 20-year anniversary of 9/11 drive the timeline?
Command Sergeant Major Jacob Smith was the senior enlisted leader responsible for shutting down Bagram Airfield. He said his advice to keep the base open in the case of an evacuation also went unheeded. Instead, he was forced to evacuate and leave only 113 Americans to protect the much less strategic Hamid Karzai Airport.
The mission asked of this company and the subsequent Marines, soldiers, airmen, sailors, and coalition forces called to reinforce the small security contingent was monumental. They were asked to control absolute panic and anarchy, and they somehow did it.
While Democrats acknowledged mistakes were made, they stressed the failures of August 2021 didn't happen in a vacuum.
Right? This was a 20-year war. This was America's longest war. Right? Multiple generations of Americans fought in this war. 4 presidencies were responsible for this war. 10 Congresses were responsible for this war.
And mistakes made throughout the 20 years of our time in Afghanistan do not justify stupidity in the end.
Republicans called the withdrawal an example of a total failure to predict and plan for worst-case scenarios, and they hammered the Biden administration for its lack of accountability.
What would happen to a leader in the military who ignored intelligence and failed to plan, in this case till the day before, resulting in troops killed? What would happen?
They would get court-martialed.
This latest hearing comes amid new reports that al-Qaeda is now back in Afghanistan. The UN Security Council warning some members of the jihadi terror organization are actually serving in the Taliban government. John?
All right, CBN's Caitlin Burke. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Well, Bill Roggio is a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. Bill, welcome to you. Let's start with the fact that the U.S. withdrawal, I don't think anyone would doubt or say against the fact that it was chaotic and messy. With our troops now out of harm's way, I guess, can we ask, was the withdrawal a necessary evil?
Well, first, the Biden administration continues to maintain that the withdrawal wasn't chaotic. Its spokesman, John Kirby, has said, he openly stated, I didn't see this as being chaotic. So the administration clings to this. The reality is not only was it chaotic, as we all witnessed, it was dangerous and remains dangerous to this day. The al-Qaeda-Taliban alliance was never broken. And this was one of the key factors that allowed the Taliban to take control of Afghanistan. And since the Taliban have taken control of Afghanistan, the United Nations report that was referenced earlier notes that al-Qaeda is running training camps in 6 of Afghanistan's provinces, safe houses in several other provinces, a media operations center. And this all tracks with my research. This is happening. This is the result of the withdrawal. People will argue that, well, there hasn't been an attack from Afghanistan to the U.S. since the U.S. left. People made the same argument in the 1990s up until September 11th, 2001, when al-Qaeda blew up the World Trade Center, shut down our airlines for days, caused tens of billions of dollars in losses, as well as 3,000 Americans and others killed.
Bill, we just saw in Caitlin's piece a smattering of some of the sound bites from the House committee hearing. In your estimation, though, and from your research, where were some of the greatest failures of the withdrawal?
The greatest failure, and I do agree with Democrats, this was a failure over multiple administrations. Once the decision to withdraw was made by the Obama administration, it was continued by the Trump administration. The idea that we could negotiate with the Taliban, that they would negotiate in good faith, that we could trust them. And then the Biden administration, despite all the evidence to the contrary, believed those things. And, Democrats can blame other administrations, but they did not execute this withdrawal. And the failure was the decision to leave. They thought they would get a decent interval as the U.S. got in Vietnam, that we'd leave and the Afghan government would hold on for a couple years. But the biggest failure was they did not see this coming. And it was obvious to those who were willing to objectively look at the information. I predicted early when he announced the withdrawal that the Afghanistan would fall by the end of the summer. It fell 5 weeks before the end of the summer. It was obvious to anyone who was paying attention closely.
Well, Bill Roggio is a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We thank you so much for your time and your insights today. Thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Well, are we heading towards or steering clear of recession? What some economists are saying about today's GDP report coming up. The U.S. economy is plowing ahead. The latest GDP report out today shows for the second quarter, the economy grew at 2.4%. That suggests the United States is steering clear of a recession. The accelerating economic growth defies expectations of a slowdown, even as the Federal Reserve has continued to push interest rates higher in its effort to fight persistent inflation. The Fed imposed a quarter-point hike yesterday in an effort to slash consumer demand and to get companies to cut back on hiring. The latest hike takes benchmark the benchmark borrowing costs to the highest level in more than 2 decades. Well, Mark Hamrick is the Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst at Bankrate. Mark, it's great to have you today. Obviously, the GDP report doesn't take into account yesterday's decision by the Fed to raise rates once again. But from your perspective, do you think we still could see some economic blowback from that?
Good to be with you, John. Clearly, when we have rising and high interest rates, that is in a position to really tax the economy, to slow down economic activity, whether it's consumers and businesses. And consumers have been cooling it. Even with this improvement in the latest GDP, they were not adding as much to the economy as business was in the sense of the quarter-over-quarter change. The real question, I think, beyond this week and for the months and perhaps even beyond that to come is that how much longer do rates need to stay higher? How much longer will the Fed keep them in that position? And what could be the economic consequences from that? But as we now sort of get almost to the halfway point of the third quarter of 2023, having been on guard for a recession really for at least a year now, we can say so far, so good.
So far, so good. But some economists warn that the government bond market is sending a clear signal of recession by displaying what's called an inverted yield curve. They point out that it takes a while before recession actually arrives. Mark, do you think we still could see a recession start sometime later this year or maybe even next year? What's the likelihood?
Certainly could. We could, John. And a recession is always inevitable. The question is the arrival time of that, the depth, the duration, the severity. We're getting mixed messages from the stock market. The blue chip averages, or from financial markets, the blue chip averages in the stock market are almost back to record highs. We've had a bull market underway, and that yield curve inversion has absolutely been sending signals. But there have been a lot of other factors that have, let's say, been influencing performance of fixed income, including the actions of the Federal Reserve itself.
Just a few seconds left. I want to talk about jobless claims. They're the lowest since February. Did you or do you expect the labor market to hold steady?
We're expecting to see hiring moderate. But, John, we see an unemployment rate at 3.6% right now, just 0.2 above the historic low. Very resilient and a more robust job market than we would have expected by now.
All right. Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. We always appreciate your time and insights. Have a great weekend, Mark.
Thank you, John.
When we come back, why Christians in Afghanistan are in mortal danger. Well, now for a deeper dive, we return to a story we talked about. Nearly 2 years after the last American troops left Afghanistan, the country's tiny Christian population is more at risk than ever. The power vacuum has been filled by al-Qaeda, which, according to a new United Nations report, now operates numerous terrorist camps where Islamic fighters are training for suicide missions. Yet, in the face of deadly persecution, Afghan believers are standing strong. CBN's George Thomas has the story.
Despite promises that Afghanistan would not become a haven again for terrorists, the 27-page UN report says groups like al-Qaeda have greater freedom for maneuver under the Taliban than before, and that the threat of terrorism is rising in both Afghanistan and the region.
The Taliban has been cooperating with al-Qaeda, has been supporting and sheltering al-Qaeda. It did it during the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and it continues to this day.
2 years after the U.S. withdrawal, al-Qaeda-linked officials are reportedly now helping the Taliban lead in 3 provincial governments and have 5 new terror training camps around the country, including one in Nuristan.
The camp in Nuristan, United Nations notes that al-Qaeda is training terrorists to conduct suicide operations.
Al-Qaeda has also opened safe houses in Kabul and 3 other provinces.
All of the locations that the UN notes where al-Qaeda is running training camps, safe houses, and media operations centers, I've tracked over the last decade and a half al-Qaeda having a presence there. Senior al-Qaeda leaders and operatives and low-level fighters have been killed in all of these provinces.
Meanwhile, the UN says the ISIS threat is also growing, leaving many Afghans, especially those who are non-Muslim, uncertain about their personal safety.
Afghan Christians are literally moving from house to house. They've switched off their phones.
Dr. Martin Parsons has worked in Afghanistan for years and says even though life for Christians is dangerous right now, it will only get worse as Al-Qaeda's strength and footprint grows.
The Taliban follow a code of Islam called the Hanafi Code, which basically says any adult male who is deemed to be a convert, to have left Islam, gets 3 days to repent and then is executed. But under Al-Qaeda, it's simply execution on the spot for Christians.
No one knows for sure, but Parsons estimates that there are between 5,000 and 20,000 Afghan Christians in the country.
Gospel is not going to be stopped by Al-Qaeda, Taliban, or ISIS.
Former Muslim and native Afghan Hussein Andarias hosts a Christian television program that's seen inside the country. He's in regular contact with secret believers who tell him they are undeterred by the growing threats.
Yesterday, I spoke with one man from Badakhshan. He says, no matter what, I will follow Jesus, even if I have to be killed, even if my entire fellowship here, he's a church pastor. We will go on trusting the Lord Jesus Christ. They are very strong.
A recent State Department report blamed both the Trump and Biden administrations for not adequately planning for the withdrawal and failed to anticipate the collapse of the Afghan government. George Thomas, CBN News.
Thank you, George. Kicking off the congressional recess with a prayer for much-needed rest, but probably not the kind you're thinking of. We explain next on Faith Nation. Respite, Counsel, and Renewal. That was the prayer of House Chaplain Margaret Kibben as members of Congress returned to their home states for the August recess.
In the quiet of these moments, may they listen for your voice, yield their wills to your will, and realign their priorities to your desired direction for their efforts.
Kibben reminding the rest of us to take Sabbath time as well and of the biblical call to pray for our leaders.
Remind the rest of us, too, to take Sabbath from the onslaught of news and media. Silence our desire for the buzzing of the latest soundbite or the thrill of the hottest political contest. May we dedicate this break in the congressional grind to pray for the health and welfare of our leadership.
Not a bad prayer for all of us to pray, both for our leaders and for ourselves. And as she said, maybe a period of rest from news and all the social media. But you can keep it still tuned here. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.